Doing well. Miss seeing y'all. I hate these are the circumstances we're doing our class under now, but it is what it is. So we're going to do the best we can do moving forward. And I want to make you aware of a few things that you need to know. First of all, there's a time marked on Wednesday for y'all to do a Zoom class. That's 10 o'clock Wednesday morning with me. That's really if you think you need review for the test, which will be coming up Thursday. You need to go over any notes. You don't understand something in the lesson. If you just want to say hello, I'll open it up at 10 o'clock and I'll send y'all those codes. Probably try to send those this evening. But that's on Wednesday morning. 10 o'clock is the 8th grade time for that. Hopefully everybody has taken advantage of the extra credit paper assignment. You can email those to me. My email address, rrooney@cambridgeacademy.org. I think your parents, all of them have that, but if not, let me know. So hopefully you took care of that. Your book assignment you can hang on to for right now, just for study and review for the terms or whatever that's in the section. So hopefully y'all got all that done as well. We're going to talk about, we talked a little bit about the election of 1860 prior to the break. We're going to go through that again. And then we're going to get into the start of the Civil War. And other than maybe the Battle of Bull Run, we won't get into any specifics of some of the battles until your next sections that we'll test on following spring break. So, and your paper assignment that you saw that would start on Friday, that's up to you. You can pick whoever you thought the best commander was during the Civil War. I know some of you got parents, a couple of you I know for sure got parents that kind of would like their Civil War buffs, and you might can pick their brain as well on that. But you got to back that up with facts and reasons why. The book, they don't even have to be mentioned in the Chapman book. It doesn't cover all the commanders of the Civil War. So that's sort of an open forum for you. Look forward to seeing those. Those will be due the Sunday following the day we get back from spring break. So we'll get back from spring break or be done with spring break. I think it's April 13th. So that following Sunday, which I think is the 19th. I'm not looking at the calendar, but you'll need to have those back to me by then. All right. Election of 1860. Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, a number of southern states were not happy with that. South Carolina already threatened to secede if he did win the nomination. He was elected president. We talked about all the tension that's been building between some of the states, in particular with the slave issue, even number of states to odd number, the Compromise of 1850, the Fire Eaters from South Carolina. We talked about all those things leading up. But Lincoln's platform, which is mentioned in your notes, was anti-slavery, supporting protective tariffs on goods, planned to give free western land to settlers, supported the construction of a transcontinental railroad that really the line started in the northern states. None of this helped the South, so I guess the tension and the bad feelings got worse at this point. And of course Lincoln did win, and then South Carolina backed up their threat to secede. So December 17, 1860, South Carolina adopted an ordinance of secession, and federal officials in Washington responded at the time that this was unconstitutional. South Carolina countered by saying, "Hey, we entered the Union voluntarily. We can leave it voluntarily." And we've talked a little bit about this before, but people argue about that to this day, at least the constitutionality of whether a state can secede or not. By February 1st, 1861, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida had joined South Carolina in seceding. There were still eight slave states that were sitting on the fence at that time, seeing what was going to happen, weren't sure what they were going to do. But these states that did secede met February 4th, 1861. Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. And they elected as president Jefferson Davis. You'll need to know that. All that right there is in your notes. There was several attempts at a compromise before James Buchanan. He was the president prior to Abraham Lincoln left office. The one that I did mention, there were several, but there's only one that's mentioned in your notes. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a series of amendments, including guaranteeing the permanence of slavery in the territories or the areas where it already existed. Lincoln rejected this. This was not something that was accepted. Lincoln, in his inaugural speech, basically said the Union was older than the Constitution and the states could not leave of their own choice, going back to the argument whether they could do so or not. He also intended to, in quotations, I put in quotations in your notes, to hold, occupy, and possess all federal property in the seceded states. Fort Sumter would be one of these. Had it not been seized by South Carolina, it was offshore, and Lincoln was determined to keep Fort Sumter for South Carolina to attack it, and this would give him reason to call out troops that would help him force the southern states back into the Union. And of course, we've talked a little bit about Fort Sumter prior to the break. And I think half the class raised their hand, said that y'all had been there. At the beginning of war, April 8, 1861, Lincoln sends supplies to Fort Sumter. You can argue that was not just simply to supply them, but maybe goad the South into doing something about it. And a few days later, they did. Confederate forces under P.G.T. Beauregard bombarded the fort the next day. Major General Robert Anderson winds up surrendering the fort. So at this point, Lincoln decides to force the states back in, calls up 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. All right, the effect on this that you'll need to know, it is in your notes, but you'll see it underneath. We talk about this, that 4 other states then seceded. That would be Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, important states, especially Virginia. We talked about some of the, military commanders that came out of that and just geographically where they are. But 4 states, they did not view that, or they may view that as heavy-handed actions by Lincoln. But there were still 4 that stayed in the Union, the border states, the slave states that did not want to secede. And this was along with the western counties of Virginia that would ultimately become West Virginia. That's in your notes as well. At the beginning of the war, the pros and the cons, or the advantages or disadvantages for both sides. The advantages were there were more to the north than the south. More than 80% of the factories in the north, while the south had to depend on supplies from Europe. So that's a pretty big deal. Just the industrial capability of the northern states was far surpassed southern capability. The north had an advantage of the railroad, with about 2/3 of railroad miles in the north. That's a big deal for transporting men, equipment, weaponry. Southern railroads, some of them had different gauges of width of tracks. That didn't help them with that. And the North had about 75% of the wealth of the nation. So you compare that to the South, and they're already at some advantages there, and then you add in the fact they already had an established army, they already had a navy, they had an experienced in-place government, they had a monetary system already in place. So the South not only is seceding and rebelling, but they're turning around and they're getting into a war immediately. So they did have a few things going for them. The southern states, is believed, really had many of the best military commanders, which we'll talk about those more as we get into the next sections. The South had military tradition. When you think of the Citadel, VMI, and Southern men was believed they had more experience on average riding horses over long distances and shooting weapons. So, and the Southerns also had a cause. They felt like they were fighting for independence from a tyrannical government, for their freedom to determine their own fate. And they had decided to fight a defensive war, which meant fighting be mostly on their own territory. They would certainly, know the terrain. There's also a belief always really in warfare that you fight harder when you're fighting on your own homeland. which makes, when you're fighting on your own property, which makes sense. But there was roughly about 9 million people in the Confederacy compared to 22 in the Union, and a third of that in Confederacy was enslaved African Americans. So you're even chopping in that further in terms of your manpower, people you're going to use in your military. So the South certainly was not in a position to get into a war of attrition, a long-standing war. It was something that for them, they probably would have needed to end it fairly quickly. Obviously, it didn't happen that way. The Union, both sides thought it was going to end pretty quickly, at least some on both sides, and they were both wrong on that as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about the strategies for the Union and the Confederates as the war started, and as it started, not just from the beginning, as it moved on into our next sections. Once again, we'll go through in your notes. You'll see it go all the way down to where you see naval actions, that section. And from what we talked about today to there is where we'll test on that. So we'll be into the Union and Confederate strategies down to naval actions in our next little session. You need to look over these, think of any questions you may have, concerns. Once again, anything like that you want to ask. We get together on Wednesday. We'll go through it. I can ask you questions, or you just, like I said, anything you think you need to know or have missed, let me know. And test will be Thursday. Format will be pretty similar to the way we have been doing it. So talk to you then. See ya.